Hi, I'm Tara.
Hi, I'm Michelle.
So, welcome back to our podcast, Books and Beyond with Bound, Season 2, which, as you know, is our quarantine edition. And today is a very, very special day because it's our co-host Michelle's birthday. So, happy birthday, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Tara. And today's episode is very special for me, not just because it's my birthday, but because we spoke to the multi-talented Rheea Mukherjee. She's a writer, teacher. She also sings Bollywood songs. We have seen some of her videos on Facebook.
Yeah, she does have a love for Bollywood and she's really inspiring. And on this episode, we spoke to her about her book, The Body Myth. So this is a book that is very different from the other fiction books that I have read. Firstly, it's set in a fictional place called Suryam, and the book traverses this very complex and steamy, if I have to say so, love story between three characters, Rahil, Sara, and Meera. And so each character has their own eccentricities, and the book sort of explores how they operate in relationship with one another. So, and also the story covers a lot of interesting topics. So one of the characters, has Munchaussen syndrome, which is a mental health disorder. I mentioned that it's a polyamorous relationship. The book also covers philosophy and so many other things. So in this episode, we found out how Rheea researched and created such believable characters and this amazing relationship between the three of them. And it's interesting because oftentimes we writers write about what they know, but in this case, she took something which was alien to her and made it her own. And on this episode, we found out how she did that.
Yeah, and she also mentions, Tara, that, what you know can always be expanded. Like, I never thought of that before. I always thought it was restricting. But this is so liberating, and I'm sure many writers will find it liberating too. And she also talks about pitch wars on the episode, which is a platform that helps writers get connected to mentors. They also find agents for their work. And Rheea has been my mentor for many years. So she's shared so many more tips on the episode. So let's dive in. Welcome, Rheea. Thank you so much for joining us on our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Michelle. I'm so excited.
So before we begin, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your most recent book, The Body Myth? What is the book about?
It's about a grieving young widow who meets this very strange and fascinating woman named Sara in very unusual circumstances. And she finds out that Sarah is married to this guy called Rahil, and they strike a very, very intense friendship, I would like to say at first, which becomes obsessive and that obsession intersects at various parts of their lives, their mental health, and even their spirituality. So it's a very insular book because it is, yes, it takes place in India, obviously in our contemporary times, in a fictional city, but it's also very insular in the sense that it sticks to really these three characters and what happens with them.
And Rheea, we really liked the character names, especially I really liked the name Rahil, because I had never come across that name. But is the name by any chance influenced by, your fascination for Bollywood and Rahul, by the character Rahul in any way?
I mean, no, I'm totally fascinated by Bollywood, but no, it wasn't by Rahul. I think I was just trying to look at some, names that could be, I mean, Meera, obviously, I think her family location was very specific in the book. But, Sara and Rahil came from mixed inter-religious marriages, which is Hindu and Muslim marriages. And I was trying to look at, what would they name their kids when you come from these kinds of different locations kind of things. And they seem to be, especially when you're looking at like a upper middle class kind of situation, the names can be a little bit vaguish or probably leaning towards something. So in my imagination, Rahil and Sara just work, and it was something that I wanted to kind of plunge into without making a big deal out of it, because I also come from an interreligious marriage, although my location is like, my mother is Catholic and father was Hindu, Bengali Hindu. So, that's also something that I wanted to like explore the urban blending of such marriages and such social realities.
So you've written a book of short stories before this. So what was the process of publishing both these books? And was that process different in any way?
Way back in, I think it was 2015, when I published a small book of short stories called Transit for Beginners. And it was from a super small, amazing press called Kitab. And, trying to publish short stories like as a collection is like, I mean, you might as well try to also climb Mount Everest. I had published some of them in literary magazines, but kind of like that's where the full stop happens, and you just, start collecting a lot of rejections, and people are like, can you please write a novel instead? Thanks. And so I was really happy when I got this kind of published. But it was at a very small scale. And but after that, it took me a few years to actually sit and write that novel, which I never thought I would do, by the way. And I think a lot of short story writers who primarily used to write short stories probably always grappled with something like this, where they're like, I don't think I can write a novel. For me, I think personally, it was just a matter of being lazy.
Yeah, I'm going through that right now.
Exactly. Yeah. So like in 2017, towards the end of 2017, I started writing this novel, and, this first draft came out really quickly, and I started writing to agents and publishers and basically collected a whole pile of rejections saying, this is not going to work. This is not happening. Not interested in this. I think I collected like 40 or 50 rejections totally from publishers and agents. And one day, an amazing agent from New York, Stacey Testa from Writer's House, she wrote back to me and said, oh, I was so pulled in by this story. Stacey not only signed me on as one of her writers, but sold the book in like 4 or 5 months to a press called Unnamed Press in LA in the US. And so the book was actually published in the US first in 2019. And after that, it was published by Penguin India a few months later. So I got very lucky because I got both an indie press and a mainstream publisher to publish that book.
And your book also deals with mental health. So why, and you specifically discuss the Munchausen syndrome. So why did you decide to include that in the book? And what is Munchausen syndrome for those who don't know?
I've always been fascinated with mental health and mental illness, as we call it, even though I think, today where I'm at, I feel like a lot of our mental illness is actually a response to a lot of trauma and oppressive structures. My past, actually, my bachelor's degree was in social work, and I worked a lot in the US in the mental health sphere. There is an obsessive quality to how we're portraying ourselves with mental illness. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. And I think when I think about the body myth, I was, coming from the perspective of, these three people who are obviously, urban people in India. They have access to certain class and caste rights that a lot of the country doesn't have. But at the same time, what are they negotiating in this world? And so these three main characters over here, you have Mira, who is the protagonist of the book, and it's in first person. And, she meets this gorgeous woman from her perspective who is having a seizure at the park, and she runs into both her and the husband under these very unusual circumstances and learns that Sarah is this chronically ill person. And, at some point, she wants to figure out whether this is all in Sarah's head, that she is chronically ill. So there's two things. There's one is called Munchausen's, and one is Munchausen by proxy, which is a lot more documented, especially in nonfiction and essays, if you look it up, because there are people who, mostly mothers, think there's something wrong with their child.
Yes, and Rheea, that reminds me of this Hulu series called The Act. That was the first time I got to know of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Oh my God, I was freaked out. I had never heard of that before.
So like these mothers take their kids constantly to the doctors, get invasive tests done all the time. They're completely convinced something is wrong with them. And it becomes something like therapeutic to these people to always cater to a sick child, or to make sure that the child is sick to the point of where they would actually make them sick to make sure that it lines up with the story and the doctors actually believe them. And that's by proxy. And then the regular version is to the point where you are doing everything you possibly can to be hospitalized, to be under medical supervision, to be interacting with medical services. So there's a lot of research they do to figure out what they could eat, what they could do to themselves to make sure that tests would always find something irregular. Therefore, they're always ill. I don't think I really explore a complete finality to what Sarah is suffering from, and I've done that by purpose.
And also, Rheea, this reminds me of Gillian Flynn's book, Sharp Objects. That Munchausen syndrome by proxy was also covered in that. And I really like how now at least there are TV shows, there are books that talk about mental health. I want to know, how did the mentoring process really help you in figuring out whether you are doing justice to portraying these issues in your book? Because I know you must have done research, you must have spoken to people, and you would have tried your best. But then I'm sure the writerly insecurities pop up somehow. So how did mentoring help you with that?
The book wouldn't be what it was without the mentoring that I got. Because yes, I wrote that draft, I did the research, I wrote the entire manuscript. But then, when it came down to somebody else's eyes who knew what they were doing, right, in terms of craft, to pull out every chapter and say, well, where's the narrative arc over here? And, why is this not filled up? A good mentor is someone who allows you the freedom of, having your idiosyncrasies when you write, but also calling you out where you've been lazy or where you haven't thought about something from the reader's perspective.
So, Rheea, you found your mentor through Pitch Wars. So, could you tell our listeners a little bit about what is Pitch Wars and a little bit about your mentor?
So my mentor is a writer called Kristen Lepionka. She is a crime and mystery writer. She's Ohio-based in the US. And she was freaking amazing for the body myth. I mean, because of her, it got to a shape where, Stacy, my agent, just took the book right up. And it was very competitive to get into Pitch Wars. I urge a lot of young writers who have finished at least one draft of the manuscript to kind of get into Pitch Wars. If you look it up, there's a website. They're mainly on Twitter. And basically what happens is you submit your manuscript and you kind of choose 4 or 5 mentors that you would like to technically work with if you get in. And I think there's like 3,000 or 4,000 people who apply every year. And I think like 100 get in. And you get assigned one of the mentors who is usually a published author or a person in the literary industry, like an agent or an editor. It was exceedingly tough. It was like 2-3 months of like really hard work, but I'm so thankful for it. And it also now helps me write my second novel with so much more ease because I'm thinking about all the things that I learned on that writing the first novel in terms of the pure technicality of it.
Ooh, what is your second novel about, Rheea? You have to tell us.
Ha ha ha. The second novel, well, I'll tell you that the second novel is still also going to be talking about a series of love stories, but through that, it's going to bring in a lot of themes that are, they're resonating very hard with me now, politically, in terms of gender, in terms of love, in terms of sex. What's exciting for me to be writing about it right now is that we're looking at a character, but through the several love stories of theirs.
That reminds me of the show Love Life. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
So it's about one character and the several love stories and the romances that she goes through. So you might like it.
No, even I haven't.
Yeah. And I'm really excited about your next novel. I love literary love stories. Like, I don't really read a lot of rom-coms, but I like, when it's put into literary fiction, which is what I generally read. And your book, Body Myth, was really interesting because it was about a love triangle. And it got really intense. So, how did this premise come to you and why did you want to explore?
Mira ends up falling in love with Sarah, but also Sarah's husband. And so I guess we can call that a triangle. But at some point, they all know. So, and they're okay with it. So, which makes it technically polyamorous, even though I wasn't really thinking about that term when I was writing the book. Yeah. So honestly, what I was trying to do was figure out what characters do, what people do, what we all do as a response to grief. And I find grief is this really interesting emotion, especially when you have the rug pulled off from your feet, as Mira did, the main character in the book, because she, married someone she loved. She had this regular life. And then, boom, in 7 months into her marriage, her husband is killed randomly in an accident. And I think in this space where everything that you thought was in control, where you have this narrative for your life, right? Like you finish your education, you get a job, you get married, and then you just think like life is set. And then when that's completely obliterated, suddenly you have this chance of not responding to the world as it has told you to be, because it's taken away so much, or what you thought was everything was taken away from you. And here's a space where you can completely reconsider it. But before that, there's so much of grief, there's so much of trauma, there's so much of crushing pain. And that's the space where Mira was kind of responding to. She wasn't really thinking about social norms or, the ideas of what she was supposed to be doing. And therefore, because of that, she allowed herself to expand her worldview. So we might call it a love triangle or polyamory. I'm calling it a response to grief.
That was one of my most, biggest takeaways. Like, how do you deal with grief? I just loved the way Meera, responded to all of that. And it reminded me of, my own best friend's death. Like, when you're faced with something that is very difficult, you just don't know how to react. You're just numb. So I just loved how you explored that through the book. We don't really see that in fiction often. You set your book in a fictional place, which is Surya. So we are intrigued to know that why did it, why was it necessary for your story to be set in a fictional place? Did you see that happening in Indian fiction, or was there a lack of it?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. And a lot of people have actually asked me this question. I'll tell you why. The reason is that I didn't want to set it in Bangalore because, fortunately or unfortunately, Bangalore is probably the only, urban Indian city that I'm most familiar with. And if I started writing it with, Bangalore in my head, I think a certain element of the mythical quality to the book. And if I set it with the city that I'm most familiar with and use the word Bangalore, I think it would have just crushed the idea of this world of Meera, Sarah, and Rahil. It would have become over familiar for me, A. And two, I feel like, Bangalore just sounds jarring to me for a story that was set, that was so insular in this kind of imaginary world. And so I wanted it to be a city that, most urban people could kind of relate to, especially in India, like brass tacks Indian hot mess of a urban reality, and without putting a specific name to it.
So what advice would you have for somebody, who wants to write about something that they maybe don't have first-hand experience with?
That's a great question. It's a really important question because it's something that can paralyze a lot of writers, and technically the whole world should be our oyster. But I think at the same point that if anything you write, no matter what you're writing, whether it's science fiction or literary fiction, everything is political in that way. They say write what you know, but then you can always expand what you know, and you can always challenge what you know. But I think it's important to understand the lens that we're writing from. Even if we're writing about the bad things in the world, whatever, like I'm just saying like a blanket statement, the bad things in the world, are we glorifying it? Are we romanticizing it? Is it coming from the right hierarchy of space that we occupy? I think these are really pertinent questions to ask. It's not that we can't write about anything, but we have to really worry about the lens. Are you writing it from a perspective where you are talking for other people? Are you writing from it from a space where you just didn't research enough? So I think that self-awareness is really, really important. And if you have that self-awareness, you also understand the lens that you're trying to study the story with.
Because I think, that is creativity, right? If you do end up writing autobiographical fiction or semi-autobiographical fiction, at the end of the day, you are not exploring your potential as a creative person. So I really think it's important to step out of your comfort zone and try something. I also know that you have dealt with over 300 rejections for your book, The Body Myth, before it was picked up by Pitchwar. So how do you deal with rejection, and what tips do you offer to writers, especially debut writers who just get rejections on a daily basis? How do they deal with it?
I've got 300 rejections probably in my literary career, not The Body Myth. The Body Myth, I probably got about 40. The thing is, rejection is a part of your writing. And I think it's surprising to me that like a lot of writers are still very surprised by this. Because how can you think that something that is so subjective in a world which is so, subjective in terms of picking up something and putting it out there in the world, you are going to be rejected if you're writing. But you have to trust, first of all, a few things. One, that you have a voice, that you want to put this voice out, that you are working on your craft, and you are being consistent in terms of putting that out there. If you are not getting rejected, you are not writing enough, or you are not putting things out there consistently, because rejection is a byproduct of being a writer. It has to be your lover. It has to be your companion throughout your literary career. It is not just because even if when you get published, you're still going to get rejected after that. Now I'm writing my second book. I can guarantee you I'm going to get a few rejections.
Things get rejected so often, and then when they finally do get published, like your book Body Myth, it gets such a positive response. You have so many readers, people love the book, and then you wonder, oh, what was it that made this book get rejected in the first place? Why was it rejected? The world works in very funny ways. So Rheea, you also run a business, Write Leela Write, which is a content studio. So how do you manage your time? Because I know that is, running a business and growing something can also be your baby, and then you have writing. So how do you switch between the two, and which is more dear to you?
I run Write Lila Write with my business partner Kalabati Majumdar, and she's the designer part. So it's also a design and content studio. And it was a very chosen outlook in life that we start a small, very small boutique company. We're just 4 people in the company, and we're going to be 7 years in May. We've somehow decided it's also a lifestyle we chose. Like, we're not going to go big. We are going to concentrate on exactly what we do best, what our core skills are, take a certain amount of clients, even if we do struggle, and have like 6-hour work days, which are all very important values for us to sustain and keep within that company. And, that's what actually allows me to have the flexibility to write and to have the flexibility to kind of engage with the writing community and do a whole host of other things. So it's actually a very chosen symbiotic thing to do. And yes, it has a lot of pitfalls. There's no regularity with money. There is some months we just have to like figure shit out, but I wouldn't have chosen it any other way. And I think I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to have built that.
It's really fascinating to know about your journey, Rheea. I mean, not just as a writer, now even as an entrepreneur, because I think both of them, writing and entrepreneurship, has a lot of unpredictability, and I think you really rock it. So, Rheea, I don't think many of our listeners know exactly how we met. So I actually got to know of Rheea's work online.
Oh my gosh, let me tell this story because it's really important. This is really important because for me, from as a writing perspective, I think this was almost 7, 8 years ago at least.
Yes, I think a decade.
Yeah,
Yes,
almost a decade for sure. 2011, 2012. I was putting out a lot of short stories, getting rejected all left and right. But then I had made a few publications. I used to put them up on Facebook, like, "Yay, look, I got published," and stuff like that. Michelle actually was one of my first actual readers, like a stranger who was online and who actually read my work and said, "Oh, I love these short stories." And she would actually post, like, "Have you read Rheea Mukherjee's stories?" And I was like, "Oh my God, somebody
I'm
said
so
that.
embarrassed now.
Somebody said that. Yeah, somebody said that about me." And it was like, and it's so, and I think it's also great to know that because people like Michelle and it makes me so happy that Michelle is now a part of Tara, what you built with Bound and all that, because it just makes so much of sense. Because Michelle's always been someone who has been invested in the writing community, not just because she's a writer, but she shares about other people. She encourages other people. She motivates other people.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with that.
Right? And she's seen my journey over the decade to, being someone who had published a couple of stories online, to publishing a small book, to having a big presence with a big novel with Penguin, and so she's seen that complete journey with me, and she herself has bloomed as a writer and taken that whole idea of rejection, on her back and persisting and writing and publishing like crazy online. And, now it's a matter of time before her book is out.
And so I wanted to know, your thoughts on literary magazines, Rheea, because I discovered all of your work, most of your work through online magazines. I remember I had kept a list of all of your short stories and I kept revisiting them. So how important do you think literary magazines are for a writer to really, discover their voice or to build a portfolio before they have a book out?
Really important because there's a lot of channels where we are publishing, right? Even online nowadays, people are publishing on Instagram and Facebook, and it's great. It's a great space, but it's also important, I think, to put yourself through that test of subjectivity. I'm not trying to say that just because it's a literary magazine, you get a leg up. It's also putting yourself through the system of saying, "Here's my subjective work." It's a place where you're trying to see how consistent you are and how you start to develop a tolerance towards rejection. Because believe me, if you're submitting to literary magazines, you are getting rejected 100%. Especially if you are really submitting to good quality literary magazines where there are a board of editors, diverse editors who are really trying to publish fresh work and make room for new writers, then definitely you are going to be getting rejected. And it also starts for you to open up your own networks with editors and other writers, encourage other writers, right? Because of this, our relationship is kind of based on that. So community is so essential to being a writer because it's such an isolating task otherwise. So I think literary magazines are a great space to kind of build your own recognition, your own your own name with other editors and the larger writing community who's paying attention to these things. When you go to an editor with a book, you also are telling them that, listen, I've been around the block. I've been writing consistently. I have been putting stuff out there. I even have a few publications out there. And it just helps your own sense of self as a writer and confidence as a writer.
Rheea, I'm always amazed by the number of ideas that writers have and the number of stories, that writers like yourselves put out. You lived in the US before moving to India, and I'm sure the writing scene must have been very different over there. So can you tell us a little bit about the difference in the attitude towards writing and literature in the US and in India?
A lot of stuff I feel like obviously in the Indian English scene of writing is now merging because of globalization. But, when I was there, it was very US centric in terms of literary magazine, in terms of how they wanted to hear voices from people of color. First of all, I mean, we all grew up during the age where, there was a lot of Indian diasporic writing was how a lot of the West accessed India. So that was like Rheea Mukherjee and Jhumpa Lahiri and, things like that, which were talking about mostly the first generation Indians and their identity issues. And then India was also therefore very exoticized and very one kind of layer to it, which of course I think India still struggles with, because there's still a lot of lack of self-awareness with Indian writers themselves in terms of how they are writing about this country in context to a global audience. But that said, I felt like there was a lot more pressure for me to write about India in a certain way when I was in the US. And obviously, when I'm in India, it's much more liberating for me to write about India as I see it, because India is a million and million stories, and you're just telling one layer of it, one idea of it, one perspective of it. And you have to have that self-awareness when you're talking about a country, especially like India. I did my MFA and I was very privileged and lucky to do my MFA. But I feel like now in 2020, there's enough resources online, enough communities willing to engage, where I think it's a very unnecessary degree also. If that's what you want to do, there are a lot of ways to do it.
A very interesting perspective.
There are a lot of collectives, there's a lot of workshops. You guys do such great work, right? And if people can consistently do things like this and take it with that same seriousness, that is an MFA in general. There's nothing special about an MFA.
Yes.
It's the same thing. It's just having that time to have discourse and read about text and discover more diverse writers and ideas about the world, and surprise yourself with what has already been written. Because believe me, there's so many things that I'm still discovering today. I'm like, wow, So it's all about that.
I just love the way you look at literature and you look at, the hunger for learning through a very different lens. So, talking about the hunger for learning, because I myself don't have a background in literature, what I've done is I try to read as much as I can. And I know that you are an avid reader yourself. So which were the books that influenced you when you were writing The Body Myth? Were there any books that you were reading while you were writing the book?
I don't think I was actually reading anything in particular when I was writing, because when I get into writing, I'm just writing. But in general, I've always been kind of drawn to slightly gothic ideas about literature. And I think I read when I say diversely, I mean, I used to read, I grew up reading like back-to-back covers of Reader's Digest and Tintin and Jackie Collins and Shobha De. And then I moved into literary fiction, the first picks were like Jhumpa Lahiri and then Orhan Pamuk and Murakami. And then, over the last couple of years, I've been very drawn to authors like Otesha Moshfegh, who wrote My Year of Rest and Relaxation. And then there is My Sister, the Serial Killer, which I know you really enjoyed. But those are the themes that I really kind of enjoy a lot from a perspective of a feminist gothic kind of perspective, contemporary. I'm a very contemporary reader. I can't, for some reason, really get into classics at all. And so that's probably my biggest regret as a writer, because I just can't get into it. I don't know what to do about it. I'm a very contemporary reader. I read a lot of nonfiction as well. So nonfiction has also driven me in terms of, and especially memoirs, because one of my favorite memoirs is The Glass Castle, and it's about a dysfunctional family, and it's just so beautifully told. And so, yeah, I guess what I would say is that, there are a lot of readers out there who are very distinct about what they read and how they read and how they interpret it. I'm not like that. I think I have the same approach to music. It's just so random and it's so all over the place. And I guess maybe that reflects in my own writing. I'm not sure.
But I like that because I like the fact that you pick up what interests you and you have a varied reading style. I think I can really relate to that because I read just about anything under the sun, whatever appeals to me in that moment. And I also read my Year of Rest and Relaxation and absolutely loved it.
Because there's so many people writing so many compelling and interesting things and we're just getting started. So it's a very exciting time. And also, I think a great time to also acknowledge that in Indian writing, not including obviously English, but in regional languages, and because we're getting access to reading more translations today, you can see that India has always had amazing boundary pushing literature in different languages this whole time. It's just that whatever we had access to in English came from either responding to from a very Western lens or, wanting to know India through a very Western lens, which is what we were catering to. And now that is completely, gone. So I think it's an exciting time to be an Indian writer writing in English also, because those boundaries are being pushed.
So let's move on to our last section, which is the rapid fire round. The US or Bangalore?
Bangalore.
Writing or playing with your dogs, Nimbo and Henna?
I think both are codependent on each other. If I'm not playing with my dogs, can't write. Both.
Okay, short stories or novels?
Nowadays, novels.
One creative habit that you're embarrassed about?
I drink too much black coffee while I'm writing, like too much, like sick levels.
What makes you laugh?
Dark jokes, like baby in a blender joke. I don't know if I should be saying that.
And what makes you upset?
Apathy.
Okay, so one new habit that you picked up in the pandemic.
I think it would have to be sitting and writing in the morning, which I never did before. I was always an evening writer. And it's been discovering the morning.
I'm just not a morning person, and I'm still struggling to find a really productive routine in the pandemic. But it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Rheea. And Tara and I were just like waiting to record with you because we have loved talking to you in the retreats and we just couldn't wait to do.
You're such a fun person.
Oh, thank you. You guys are an absolute delight to talk to you guys anytime. Love working with you guys. Love talking with you guys.
Tara, that was such a treat. I mean, we all are in different places, Goa, Bombay, Bangalore, but we recorded as if we are just sitting across from each other. I just wish that didn't end.
Yeah, really. And it's so amazing, meeting Rheea at our retreats and all of those things. So having these sort of conversations is fabulous. But I'm really looking forward to our next episode as well, because we are going to be speaking to another really special author. And we were a little starstruck when we got her to agree to be interviewed by us.
A little is an understatement.
Yeah. So without further ado, it is Tahira Kashyap. She has been writing and making films, and she's recently written a book called The 12 Commandments of Being a Woman. So once again, if you haven't checked out this book, you must check it out. We laughed throughout the book. There were so many funny incidents, and she has been so candid about all aspects of her life, including her love life with Ayushmann Khurrana. So tune in.
Yeah, she's opened up like never before. And as always, we are on Instagram @Bound Podcast. Please do follow us and let us know what you think of our episodes. And we are always looking for book recommendations. Bye. Until next time.
See you.